So Sinners has been hugely successful over the past week, and I'm all for it. I love this film. I think it's a great film. If you haven't seen my review, that's the last video on the channel. I'll link it in the cards in this video as well. However, with that being said, Warner Brothers has taken a major risk in producing this film, which is that they have forfeited the rights to the ownership of the film after 25 years to Ryan Coogler. Why is this a major success for Ryan Coogler, and why is this a failure on Warner Brothers' part? In this video, I'm going to get into it. I'm going to take us through the sort of story of how this came about, what Ryan Coogler saw in his deal, and why Warner Brothers felt pressure to give him the rights to the movie, and what this means in the long term for the film industry, or what it could mean, and what it might not mean. If Warner Brothers sorts their act out, if other studios just outright say, no, we're not doing that. So in the beginning, there was a bidding war for Sinners. Ryan Coogler had written this movie off the back of the Black Panther series, his Creed movie, and Fruitvale Station. This is his 5th outing as a feature film director. He is someone who has been well sought after. And so because he had produced the script and had sent it to studios, there ensued a bidding war for Ryan Coogler's signature to sign with the studio. In seeking his deal, there were 3 major points that Ryan Coogler sought. The first was monetary, which is first dollar gross points. This means that as soon as the film made $1, Ryan Coogler got a portion of that. He didn't get a portion of the earnings of the film after it started turning a profit. As soon as the film started making money, even though the studio hadn't yet turned a profit, he started gaining a profit. So that's even before the studio goes, yeah, money in our pocket, whilst they're just trying to earn their budget back, Ryan Coogler is already making money himself. This means that whether or not Sinners actually turns a profit, which I don't think it will, I think that's going to be a long, hard road for it to do, and it requires a lot on the word of mouth of people who've already seen it. Even if it doesn't turn a profit, Ryan Coogler has already turned a profit on this film. So I don't know what the percentage is that he got of first dollar, but let's say that this film has already made around 60 million at the box office, is the belief. If his deal is 10% of that, he's made $6 million off this movie. And that's before his signing on bonus. That's before what he got just purely as his deal to make the movie with the studio. That's before all that sort of stuff. 6 million, sizable profit. That's good for a AAA director who isn't in that sort of upper echelon of triple tier. Then the second thing is something that a lot of AAA directors seek, and in today's industry, I would say that a fair amount of them get it, and that is final cut. You know, your Nolans, your Tarantinos, your Bong Joon-ho's most recently, all these directors get final cut decisions, albeit not all the time, albeit sometimes they work with a studio that is, you know, more like, we're not giving you that we reserve final cut on all of our projects. But when you enter that upper echelon, final cut is something that a lot of directors seek. As I said, Nolan has this on every one of his projects. Tarantino has this on every one of his projects. But again, Coogler isn't someone who I would say is it yet in that echelon. Maybe this movie and maybe this IP elevates him to that, but he isn't yet in that. So the fact that he was able to get a final cut is significant. And again, we'll go into why I think Warner Brothers felt it necessary to give him that in order to secure his signature for this film. And then the final thing, which is the main thesis of this video, is the main theme of this video, is the fact that after 25 years, he gets ownership rights around Sinners. So why was this necessary for him? Why did he feel like this was a film that he wanted to own? Is this a trend? Is he going to continue to do this more? Or is this symbolic? Business Insider reports from one of their interviews with him that owning a film about black ownership was a meaningful sticking point for Ryan Coogler, meaning that this was something that during the bidding war he was very stuck on. I will not sign with any studio that does not give me ownership over this film. Now, that's a hard bargain to drive. As what I'll go into in this video, I think there is only one studio, and that is the studio that he eventually signed on with, Warner Brothers, that would have given him that. I don't think there is any other studio that was desperate enough to give him this. I just think that no other studio is in that much of a hole where they needed the signature of a major AAA director. Whilst I'm happy for Ryan Coogler, I'm also interested in how influenced were Warner Brothers by their desperation and their sort of shithole of a situation that they were like, yeah, we just have to do this. And so it's worth noting that very few directors ever gain ownership. This is something that I wouldn't even say, your upper echelon directors get. This is something that your upper echelon directors get. A major deal for Ryan Coogler that he gets this, and I think it's, as he says, it's symbolic. It's something that he desired and thought was important because of the nature of the film. The main theme being that this is about black ownership and about culture vultures attempting to creep in on black culture and black ownership, and how there is a fight among minorities to keep their culture and their properties and their ownership and not take outside influence as much as possible, because that outside influence often turns to be parasitic rather than symbiotic. So that's the Coogler side of it. What does the industry think of this writ large before we get into this in a deeper manner? I think the murmurings seem to be that studio execs outside of Warner Brothers are very worried about this. They believe that, as it says on screen, it sets a very dangerous precedent and it could be the end of the studio system. Now, a lot of this could be hyperbolic. It could be studio execs just having anxiety about the situation and worrying and believing, could this be worse for us? Maybe it doesn't impact them at all. Maybe not. If a director who isn't in that echelon of Tarantino and Nolan is gaining ownership rights over their films, then you have to not necessarily worry on our side, but as a studio exec, you have to worry about, does this open the floodgates to more directors seeking that? Who's the next director that could get that? And I have a list of directors that I think possibly could seek that with their next film or with a film further down the line. You have a bit of a dichotomy here of two sides, and I think as consumers, we are just watching this and we can basically form our own opinions on this situation. I think ultimately it doesn't really affect us, other than maybe it affects the kind of movies that are being made, and it kind of affects how we go about seeing movies. And what do we see movies for? Do we see it for the people who are actually making the movies, or do we see them because we're interested in an IP? I think if more directors own their IPs, there is a chance that we are more influenced by the directors to see something, whereas if studios own it, we're seeing films because we enjoy the IPs themselves, and the director is therefore largely inconsequential with a lot of these IPs. Marvel, the John Wick series now, I would even say the Matrix series, you're not really seeing it because of the directors, you're just seeing it because, oh, it's the Matrix. I think there's a dichotomy there of, you can either see it from the studio's perspective and say this sets a very dangerous precedent, I'm worried about this, or you can see it from the director's perspective and go, no, I'm very happy for the director, I'm very happy writ large that this opens the gate for more directors to have ownership rights, and I want to see more people gaining it. Personally, I'm not really sure how I feel about either. I sort of sit somewhere in the middle where I can see the benefit of the studio system. I just also believe that in some aspect, the studio system has outlived its purpose because it isn't finding talent in the same way. And as we can see with this story, they are desperate and they are seeking out that talent, but they're having to put up more and more money, more and more acquiescence in terms of special privileges, and yet they're not bringing in new talent all at the same time. They're actually, in many respects, I would say, failing to find new talent. And so that's worrying to me. And I question, what is actually the purpose if you're not sort of harbouring and sort of nurturing new, fresh talent? If you aren't doing that, then what is the purpose of a studio ultimately? Could a director do that? Could a director own IP and essentially farm it out to newer, younger directors and go, yeah, you make it, I own this, I want to see what your vision is with this property? If studios can't do it, then I don't see why we shouldn't just give it to the directors and let them do it. But again, I see the purpose of a studio in terms of housing all of these different things and having that business aspect to it and going, well, we think that this is going to make more money, so we're going to put more money into this. Whereas this other project we're very passionate about, but we don't think it's going to make as much money, so we're going to put less money into it. Whereas a director doesn't really view things with that lens. They just go, well, I want to make the best thing possible, so I want to just funnel money into it. It's a worrying precedent for the studio system, and I can see why they're worried about it. I think there is value to the studio system, but also it is struggling to adapt, and it has been struggling to adapt for about 15 or 20 years now. And I wonder if studios have perhaps outlived their usefulness. I don't believe completely that's true, but also I wonder about where is your next generation. I feel like a lot of directors are almost just cropping up out of nowhere and are cropping up on the indie scene, and then Hollywood is going, Jesus, just give them whatever they want because we need to get them in here. And that is worrying for them, but ultimately for us, again, we just look at it, or should look at it, and go, I want good movies. So that's the brief layout of the deal itself, and is the brief layout of the back and forth and the sort of dichotomy, as I say, is between the studio itself and the studio system and what Ryan Coogler's deal means writ large. But I want to get more into who actually already owns some of their rights to their films. How exclusive is this club? And what does it mean that Coogler is now in that sort of category? So if we start with a quote from a Vulture article that I read on the topic of this Coogler deal, then the belief from within the studios is that studios exist for one simple reason: to build a library. So if studios aren't building a library, if they're just giving away their IP to directors that made it after a certain point, then what is the purpose of a studio? You can't earn revenue down the line by sort of profiting more and more from those IPs. It's why we see films like Halloween, or series like Halloween, Scream, Indiana Jones and things like this constantly rolled out every 10 or 15 years to go, oh, here's a new film. What can we do with this one? Or going, well, here's a new younger director. What can this new younger director do with this property that we haven't already seen? Or can he do it in a new way that we have seen, but it is just a bit fresher for a modern audience? The belief is that if you're going to give away ownership rights, it has to be for the most select few directors who, in some sense, are untouchable in terms of a studio must keep this director. You must keep this director happy at all costs. And that is, a very reserved class of directors. I would argue that in the modern era, since about 2010, there's been no one that has really entered that class of director. And I question whether or not Coogler actually opens that door of ownership to a sort of lower rung level of director that isn't necessarily on the level that we're talking about here. So I've collected a few names that I found on the internet who apparently, according to reports, have ownership of their films, or at least partial ownership of their films. And we're just going to go through them one by one and sort of discuss the level at which that director is operating. Now, with that being said, I will say that the opening director on this list I actually found quite confusing. I wouldn't have expected that Richard Linklater owns Boyhood. I regard Richard Linklater to be a very, very great director. I think he's one of the premier directors in sort of the independent space. I'm not sure he's operating at a level now that is as good as what he was operating at with Boyhood, Dazed and Confused, the Before trilogy, but nevertheless, he is a premier director in that sort of space. So if possibly a studio believed that Boyhood was going to be a success because they had a premier independent director working on it, and it was a great experiment that was sort of enticing for studios or for audiences anyway to go, this film's been made over 11 years. That's very strange. I wonder what that's about. Then maybe they would have been enticed to give him Boyhood. But even with Linklater, that's only partial. He hasn't got full ownership over Boyhood. That is only partial. Now, whether that's something that increases or maybe even just stagnates over time, I'm not sure. But again, this is one that feels like a bit of an outlier, and it could have just been that he's taken a lower cut. I'm not too sure. But I also don't think that Coogler is necessarily operating at a level that Richard Linklater has done over the course of his career. And Linklater has had a much longer career than Coogler so far. That's no slight against Coogler. I'm just saying that when Linklater released Boyhood, he was at sort of a pinnacle of his career. He had sort of built up to that sort of magisterial sort of film. Whereas Coogler, I feel like, is just now ascending that mountain. And with Sinners, I believe that he is getting to the top of it. And if this isn't his peak, it's very near his peak. And then next is one that actually wasn't a director who owns it, but it was the producer, and that is Peter Jackson owning the rights to District 9. This is entirely because he bankrolled the production of District 9 for Neil Blomkamp's debut feature. But this is one that, again, I feel is a bit more of a symbolic one than anything, because this isn't actually him sort of taking it from a studio and going, no, I want to keep this because I made it. This is just him going, well, I bankrolled it, so why would I give it to the studio? But I wanted to put it in there anyways because I found it interesting and I didn't know anything about that. And then the two big ones that really symbolize what I'm talking about when I say that it's an upper class C-suite sort of like director who owns their properties or that owns their IPs. And those two directors are, of course, Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino. So Nolan, from what I can see, I don't think there is much that is actually confirmed about what he owns or when he started owning any of his IPs. But my belief is that given how Warner Brothers handled Tenet and how desperate Universal were to get Nolan on board for Oppenheimer and now The Odyssey, my belief is that Universal has probably given him some sort of ownership right over Oppenheimer and then over The Odyssey as well. I believe that actually this is probably a good deal for Universal in the sort of short term, but perhaps in the long term it is, of course, not as good of a deal. But you have to think that at the box office, Universal made off Oppenheimer $976 million against a $100 million budget. That is essentially something like a $700, maybe $600 million profit after marketing. With Nolan, this was something that I think Universal just had to give him, because if it hadn't have been them, then another studio would have given him ownership rights. So with Nolan, it's something that I think was he probably wouldn't have gotten it if Warner Brothers hadn't have been so stupid and just let him go after the Tenet disaster in 2021. Even with him, this is unconfirmed. It is unconfirmed whether it's partial, whether it's full, or whether it's going to be full after a certain amount of time. And it is something that I also believe with The Odyssey, I think will potentially be even more of a good decision, because I actually think that given the cast of The Odyssey, there's a good chance that this film is going to be even more popular, because Oppenheimer, if you think, it's got an A-list cast, but it doesn't have an A-list cast that I would say heavily appeals to younger generations, particularly those who I would say are now approaching that sort of age where they can go to the cinema and watch a Christopher Nolan film. But having a Christopher Nolan film with Tom Holland and Zendaya, that alone is going to net you a younger fan base that might just push you over that $1 billion sort of box office that Universal is definitely seeking with Christopher Nolan. And if it's not this one, I would suspect that maybe even it's his next film, because I think there's a potential trilogy here with Universal where it's just going to be the biggest event film of that year, or maybe even top two, because with Oppenheimer, of course, Barbie was the biggest film of that year. The difference between the Christopher Nolan deal and the Ryan Coogler deal is that Nolan, when he signed on to make Oppenheimer with Universal, was guaranteed to whatever it was that he made next would make $1 billion. Sinners isn't. It has yet to actually make its budget back. And I hope it does. I hope it somehow turns a profit. But it's nowhere near it yet. So giving ownership to a director and then taking away some of your actual profit, making your profit margins that's much smaller, and then giving away Final Cut as well. That's a major deal to make for a director that you don't know if it's going to be financially successful. And whilst I understand it, and again, I'm happy for Coogler himself, I don't see how that's a success for Warner Brothers personally. So there is a difference between the deals made for Tarantino and the deals made for Nolan, and the deal made for Coogler. Two of those were made out of, this is C-suite director, we want to bring him on, we know whatever whatever he makes is going to be successful. And a director who was Premiere, who was AAA, but hadn't yet been confirmed as a hit maker on his name alone. And so two of these deals were made out of sheer confidence, and the other one was made out of desperation to turn a profit, to turn around a dying studio. And that's unfortunate, but that just is the reality of the situation. But we'll skip over Tarantino and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but the deal essentially is that over time, his ownership stake in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood slowly increases and takes away, the percentage away from Sony. This, again, was a deal that I just think Sony had to make in order to secure him, or else someone else would have got him after he left the Weinstein Company. But this isn't something that is entirely surprising, similar to Nolan. I think this is one that was made out of sheer confidence that whatever he made was going to be successful. So then I've got a brief overlay here of what is happening at Warner Brothers and why I believe that they thought it was necessary to take this decision, and why they believe that it was necessary for them to just give Coogler whatever he wanted. And you can see that they believe that it was necessary to give him whatever they wanted, because they have also given other directors whatever they wanted. So this isn't something that they went, oh, Coogler, we just want to work with this guy. What a guy. Prestige filmmaker. So we're just going to give him whatever. This is something that they went, fuck, we're dying. How do we get directors in here? We'll give them whatever they want, and then we'll give them ownership as well. And it's a short-term desperation move made, and it is now, I think, in the long run, in the next 5-10 years, you're going to see more directors going to Warner Brothers and going, well, I want ownership as well. Why wouldn't I get it? And actually, there's one on here that I would go, this guy is going to be feeling, if you're looking at the list, you already know who it is. But you've got to be going, if you're that guy, you're going, why the fuck didn't I get that? I'm fucking better than that guy. The fuck? So COVID happens, all the cinemas shut down, no theatres are making money quickly. A lot of these theatres that were already struggling start to go out of business anyways. And if they're not, they're basically living along the breadline. They can't pay their employees, and they're struggling. In 2021, theatres start open. They have a select few films that are in, and they have to keep the showings, COVID friendly, all that sort of thing. Warner Brothers is the only studio to announce that alongside their films going back to theatre, they will also be released day and date on HBO Max, which is now Max. Stupid name, but directors that they had in their wheelhouse basically revolted, I would say. So the shorter end of that is that Dune director and writer Denis Villeneuve penned an op-ed in Vulture and said, this is basically the death of the Dune franchise. And I actually think that if you look at the numbers for the first Dune and even the second Dune, they've done very well. But they would have done even better if you just went, no, you're going to the cinema to see this. We're not putting this on HBO Max until 2 months later. And because of the dummy that was running Warner Brothers at the time, I actually can't remember the guy's name, but he was the founder of Hulu as well, and he was an executive at Amazon for a while. Because of his decision that, oh no, we're going to push our streaming service more, because of that, it did result in Dune actually being less financially successful than it could have been. And then, on top of that, you lost Christopher Nolan. And just because of that, and then a lot of smaller directors sort of essentially jumping ship as well and going elsewhere where they could secure theatrical releases. Or if they're not going to secure theatrical releases, they can at least secure bigger budgets at somewhere like Netflix or Amazon. Because of that, your company is now essentially in the throes. You've essentially lost a lot of your reputation with premier filmmaking talent. And now you're going, shit, what do we do? So in 2022, Warner Brothers loses that CEO, gets rid of him, and they bring in David Zaslav, who isn't a CEO that particularly looks at talent and goes, oh, I want to cater this, I want to, do whatever it is for them. But he is someone who is aware of talent and is aware of the need for it. Amazon merges with MGM, and with that, they lose premier producers and longtime studio chiefs Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdi. They are then brought in by David Zaslav to essentially rejig the Warner Brothers studio and to essentially save it from the throes that it's in. So they bring in these big time producers and studio chiefs in order to rejig the studio. And these are well known producers and well known studio chiefs. Particular Michael DeLuca he's worked with guys like PTA. He was a producer on American History X, 21. The 50 Shades trilogy. So he is a hugely successful guy. He has uncovered some talent, worked with great premier directors. So their remit immediately once they come in is to start greenlighting some major projects with big name directors, or at least premier directors, sort of authoristic directors, and then give them whatever budgets they want. So with out of their desperation, they get guys like Bong Joon-ho, who recently did Mickey 17. They get Paul Thomas Anderson, who most recently is making One Battle After Another with Leonardo DiCaprio. That has a budget of around 150 million apparently. Then you got Ryan Coogler, of course. You have Maggie Gyllenhaal, who is making Bride, an adaptation of Frankenstein, which is an $80 million budget, which is a massive budget period piece and an adaptation of a horror franchise. And then you have Emerald Fennell, who they've apparently given around $80 million or an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which again is a massive budget for a period piece. So there's been a clear focus on bringing in these auteurs, and as a result of that, and out of Warner Brothers' desperation, that has left the door open to more directors seeking these rights. Most famously and most recently, Bong Joon-ho specifically had arguments with studio chiefs at Warner Brothers over final cut decisions. And actually, I'm of the opinion that had the studio cut out a little bit more, the film would actually probably be received a bit better, at least to me. Because of the position that the studio was in, they gave Bong Joon-ho final cut, and they lost the rights to that. PTA, similar, has, final cut rights, had that $150 million budget. Gyllenhaal, Fennell, unproven directors in my opinion, and they've got major budgets as well. There is a desperation among Warner Brothers and the executives. There's a desperation at Warner Brothers, specifically among the C-suite executives and the CEO. But on the other hand, whilst Coogler, in my opinion, is not to the level of a Tarantino, Nolan, Linklater, the capitalizing that he has employed upon a sort of dying or failing studio and taking it for what it's worth and getting what he wants out of it should absolutely be applauded. That is, as someone who believes that society should focus more on the individual, that is exactly what I want. Or someone like that guy. Well done to him. Very good. Do more of that. Encourage other young black filmmakers, other young minority filmmakers, or even young female directors to go and do more of that. Take them for what they're worth, ultimately. And that is exactly what he's done in this case. And it is directly, in my opinion, because of the desperation that Warner Brothers has felt, that has left the door open to produce projects that they're passionate about. I think that this desperation is going to produce some great films, like PTA's One Battle After Another, and like Sinners, but ultimately I think in the long term this is probably bad for the studio system, and it's probably bad for Warner Brothers itself, and isn't, I think, ultimately going to make them very much money. Then my question is, what happens next? What does the future look like for specifically Warner Brothers, but also the studio system writ large, and what does it look like for the directors who are now probably looking at this and going, shit, I can get this as well. They are well aware of the fact that after 25 years, they will lose the revenue from Sinners. They must keep making money from this property now if they believe that there is any money to be made from it, which means Sinners 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But also you can only do that, presumably, with Ryan Coogler at the helm, and that doesn't seem like something that he's going to be doing right away. He has the X-Files remake coming up, the TV show, and then he has the third and presumably final Black Panther movie. So why would he be in any sort of position where he goes, yeah, I'm going to do that? But then if you do it with another director that isn't approved by him, he's just going to go, great, well, I'll not work with you anymore. And then you've done all this work to secure Ryan Coogler's signature, and then you've lost it over one film. That doesn't make any sense. So they are essentially at Ryan Coogler's beck and call. When he becks, they will call. So with Sinners and with Ryan Coogler specifically, I think Warner Brothers are kind of, and they're just going to have to hope that Ryan Coogler has an idea for this soon, or that he has a director in mind that he'll go, yeah, I'll sign off on that person doing that. Aside from that, I think, before directors go and start seeking ownership from, your Universals and your Legendaries and your Paramount and your Disney, I think it's more likely that directors will first seek it with Warner Brothers and go, well, what can I get from them? Because now they're going to smell blood in the air and they'll go, great, maybe I can get it. So I think firstly, directors will go internal at Warner Brothers and go, what can I get from you? If I can get what I want, great. If I can't, I'll go external. And they know that they're going to get it somewhere. Because if Warner Brothers don't offer it, someone else will have to offer it. And if they go to Warner Brothers and go, and Warner Brothers go, yeah, we'll offer it, then they go external and go, well, they're offering it, so what are you going to offer it to beat it? and then you just go up and up and up and up. And so, basically it's a war of attrition. But it's going, well, when will the book stop? I think it stops at very expensive budgets. I think this is just going to make budgets sort of balloon even more, because I think Warner Brothers, it's already kind of ballooning. What success at the box office has Paul Thomas Anderson really had to justify a $150 million budget? I don't think that's going to work. I think you might turn somewhat of a profit purely because you have Leonardo DiCaprio involved. But other than that, I don't think his career itself has justified that kind of budget. Regardless of what idiots on the internet tell you about, oh, well, PTA is one of the best directors ever, so he deserves it. No. Successful directors at the box office deserve big budgets because they're the money makers. And it is those directors who are successful at the budget or at the box office who will then finance a $40 million movie for Paul Thomas Anderson. That's how that works. So I don't think this situation gets much better, in my opinion, for Warner Brothers unless they start to change tack and unless they have some major hits on the horizon that I just don't think are there, personally. I think their next major hit is probably Dune, and that's at least 18 months away. So I think the worst case scenario for studios writ large is basically what I've just said there, which is that more directors are going to keep seeking ownership, which means that studios must keep developing IP constantly, which this era of IP that we are supposedly in is just going to make it worse, because they're going to go, well, we're losing this in 25 years, so we need more. And they're going to be constantly on the cusp of, we need to make more IP. With that being said, the one silver lining is that means they must constantly develop original movies, whether or not those original movies are good. Because I doubt whether or not a lot of directors actually have that sort of creative ability to write a movie and write an original movie that is to the level of a Sinners, that is to the level of a Magnolia even. I'm talking about PTA's Magnolia there. They must keep developing IP. They must keep finding new talent that are willing to work with them, even if it means losing the ownership rights in 20-25 years. And I also think that one thing that I would highlight here is, does the amount of time that they're talking about the rights reverting, does that actually come down? Because if it's 25 for Coogler, I don't see why someone like Christopher Nolan can't go, well, I want 20, and then Tarantino go, well, I want 15. And then you're again just in that war of attrition of like, when does that stop? That's the worst case for me, in my opinion, for studios. Or, as I've got written here, you convince directors to house with them. So Warner Brothers convinces Coogler the best place for your Sinners movie to be after 25 years is still to be at HBO Max. And that's where you're going to make more money, which I don't think is entirely true. I think probably the best place for it to be is somewhere like Disney Plus or Netflix. On the other hand, possibly the best case scenario for Warner Brothers and for studios is for Sinners to just not be that popular, and then you have an excuse to go, oh, well, actually this didn't work, so we're not giving this deal to anyone else, because Ryan Coogler's movie proved to be a flop, and so we don't have to give it to anyone else. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's enough buzz online that, and there's going to be enough directors who will look at this and go, well, I've got a better movie on the horizon that I believe in more and can be more successful than Ryan Coogler's Sinners, so I'm going to pursue it anyways. Even if he wasn't a success, I don't see why I can't be. And then I think that's the catch-22 that the studios have put themselves in, specifically Warner Bros. Have put everyone else in. You get the question of, who is next? Who is the director next that pursues this? I think the biggest one for me that I'm looking at going, why wouldn't he do it? Outside of your Nolans and your Tarantinos, and I think that PTAs should inevitably be on that list, in my opinion. I think of that newer generation that you're talking about, I think Robert Eggers is the most obvious one. Who's really creating original movies like him? And I know that Nosferatu wasn't obviously original, but his interpretation of it is pretty original, I would say. Who's creating original movies like him? And why wouldn't he pursue that? And why, I think it's somewhere like Warner Brothers, why wouldn't he get that? I think he's a better director, in my opinion, than Coogler. He has more of a distinctive style than Coogler. He has more of a creative voice, in my opinion, than Coogler. So why wouldn't Warner Brothers give it to him? And then you've got others that I'm less hot on. Nia DaCosta, Emerald Fennell, Zach Cregger. Zach Cregger would actually be the guy where I'd go, yeah, weapons, that looks fucking creepy. Barbarian, I loved. But I think it's basically just a who's who of who could get it. It's just a case of waiting and seeing who's the next one. Of course, Bong Joon-ho, who I've already mentioned. I feel like he's probably on that list as well, but it remains to be seen whether or not he sort of heads in a downward slump from me. Parasite, Mickey 17, Parasite, Mickey 17. Where's that next movie? Is it that way or is it back that way? So, that is what it is. I think more directors will seek this, and I think it's probably going to be someone we know. I hope, in a sense, that it is Robert Eggers, because I fucking love that guy. If it's not him, I would hope Zach Cregger's. Again, he is someone that I think has a wholly unique vision that he could turn into a major intellectual property. So I think in many cases, I think what I'm talking about, it depends heavily on Warner Brothers. I think if their slump continues and they're not able to dig themselves out of this, I think the desperation increases. And then I think as the desperation increases, directors will be able to get more out of them. And then I think that's the long and short of it. But ultimately, I'm happy for Ryan Coogler. And I'm happy that more directors are probably going to pursue what he's doing here. I don't really feel either way. I feel on the one hand, sort of, that there is a bit of a dangerous precedent here for studios, but I also think that studios have probably outlived their usefulness in some sense. But on the other hand, I'm also like, great, let's see what the directors have got. And can your media companies actually change the landscape? Can you do something better than what they're producing themselves? It's a strange time, it's a transitionary period, and I'm not really sure which way is best. But at least with Sinners, we'll see what Ryan Coogler cooks up in 25 years' time, and we'll see what he cooks up with it in the meantime. So that's the end of this. This is a pretty long video. I didn't expect it to be this long, but thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you if you made it this far. Peace.